It was a Tuesday in March when my entire life nearly collapsed over a voicemail I almost didn't check. I'd been on call for 36 hours straight. I was a licensed structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, the kind of job where you spend your days making sure buildings don't fall on people and your nights apparently making sure your family doesn't either. I had just gotten home, kicked off my boots, and was about to eat cold takeout standing over the kitchen sink when my phone buzzed. Not a text, a voicemail, from a number I didn't recognize, area code 704. I almost ignored it. The message was from a woman named Portia. She said she was a loan compliance officer at a regional commercial lender called Meridian Capital Group. She said she was calling regarding a business acquisition loan currently in default. She said the primary guarantor on the loan was me. She said the amount was $380,000. I set down the takeout container. I played the message again. I heard my name, my social security number's last 4 digits, my home address in Charlotte. All of it correct. All of it mine. On a loan I had never seen, never signed, never heard of. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was panicking, though I was, but because the moment I pulled up my credit report and saw that delinquency sitting there, like a tumor, no one had told me about, something else happened. Something colder. Something that had been building for years without a name. I finally had a name for it. Have you ever been the person in your family that everyone calls when the lights get shut off? Let me know in the comments, because that was me. That had always been me. My name is Avery. I'm 31. I have a PE license, a mortgage, and until that Tuesday in March, a carefully maintained belief that if I just kept showing up for my family, eventually they would stop needing me to. I grew up in a small city outside of Greensboro, North Carolina. My mother, who I'll call by the name she preferred, Colette, never mom, always Colette, ran a small catering business out of our house for most of my childhood. My brother, 4 years younger, was the one she poured into. Soccer camps, private tutoring, a used car at 16 that I'd never gotten. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I say it because it matters for what comes next. I left for NC State on a partial scholarship and a work-study job. I paid the rest myself. When I graduated and passed my licensure exam, Colette told her friends I'd gotten lucky. When I bought my condo at 28, she asked if I could co-sign a lease for my brother, who had just lost his 3rd job in 2 years. I co-signed. That was the first time. After that, there was the $9,000 I wired when Colette's catering band broke down, and she said the business would fold without it. There was the $14,000 my brother needed to avoid eviction after a breakup. There was the $6,500 I put on a credit card for what Colette called an emergency roof repair, which I later found out was a sunroom addition she'd wanted for years. I paid all of it. Every time. Not because I had endless money. I didn't. But because every time I tried to say no, Colette would call me selfish. She would remind me of every sacrifice she'd made. She would go quiet in a particular way that meant the next family gathering would be tense and pointed and full of comments about how some people had forgotten where they came from. It was cheaper emotionally to just pay. I know how that sounds. I lived inside it for years without being able to see it clearly. That voicemail from Meridian Capital was the first time I saw it clearly. I didn't call Colette. Not yet. I called my attorney. His name is Philip, and I'd used him once before for a contract dispute at work. He's the kind of lawyer who answers his phone on the second ring even at 11 at night, because he's the kind of lawyer who knows that the people who call at 11 at night are the ones with real problems. I told him everything. The voicemail, the credit report, the delinquency, the number. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Avery, a guarantor signature on a commercial loan is a legal obligation. If the primary borrower defaults, the lender comes after you. Your assets, your accounts, your professional license, my PE license. In North Carolina, a professional engineer's license can be suspended or revoked for conduct involving fraud or financial dishonesty. A $380,000 commercial default tied to my name was not a paperwork error. It was a threat to the thing I had spent a decade building. The only thing in my life that no one had ever been able to take from me. Philip said, I want you to send me everything tonight, and I want you to freeze your credit first thing tomorrow. I said, what do we do after that? He said, we find out who signed your name. I already knew, but I needed proof before I could say it out loud. The next morning, I drove to Meridian Capital's local office. I brought my passport, my PE license, a notarized copy of my signature from my firm's HR files, and Philip on speakerphone in my jacket pocket. The loan officer, a tired-looking man who clearly did not want to be having this conversation, pulled up the file. He turned the screen toward me. The signature on the guarantor line did not look like mine. Not really. It had the general shape of my name, but the pressure was wrong. The loop on the A was closed the way I never close it. Whoever had forged it had probably traced it from something. A check, maybe. A birthday card. I took a photo with my phone. Philip said, don't say anything else, just thank him and leave. I thanked him and left. That evening, Philip called me. His voice had changed. Not alarmed exactly. More like the voice of someone who has found something under a rock and is being careful about how he picks it up. Avery, he said, the loan was originated 8 months ago. The primary borrower is listed as a business entity called Colette & Kin Enterprises, LLC. The registered agent for that LLC is your mother. I sat down at my kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. I just ended up there. He kept going. The business address is your childhood home in Greensboro. The stated purpose of the loan was to purchase a commercial kitchen space and expand the catering operation. There's a secondary signatory on the loan. Not you. Someone listed as a silent investor. I asked who. He said, a man named August. Your mother's older brother. I stopped breathing for a second. My uncle August had not been part of our lives since before I was old enough to remember him clearly. Colette's version of the story, the one she had told so many times it had become family scripture, was that August had embezzled money from a restaurant group they had briefly co-owned with my grandfather in the early 90s. She said he had nearly bankrupted the family, stolen everything liquid, and disappeared. She said she had rebuilt from nothing, alone, while August lived somewhere in Florida off money that wasn't his. That story was the reason Colette claimed the moral high ground in every argument. I rebuilt from nothing. I sacrificed everything. She used it the way some people use a wound, not to heal, but to hold over whoever was in the room. Philip said, I ran a background check. August has no criminal record, no fraud convictions, no civil judgments, nothing. He owns a property management company in Sarasota. He's been operating it for over 20 years. I said, that's not possible. Philip said, he's also left 3 messages with my office in the last 48 hours asking to speak with you. There's a moment, I think, in every story like this where the ground shifts, where the thing you built your understanding of your own life on turns out to have been built on someone else's story about what happened. That was my moment. On the kitchen floor, in a Charlotte condo I'd bought with money I'd earned, with a $380,000 default on my credit report and an uncle I'd been taught to think of as a criminal trying to reach me. I told Philip to set up the call. I drove to his office the next day. August was on video, not in person. He was in his early 60s, wearing a plain gray shirt, sitting in what looked like a home office with bookshelves behind him. He looked tired but composed. He looked, I remember thinking, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally put it down. He said, "You look like your grandfather." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "I was told you stole from the family." He nodded. "I know." He said it without any anger, just a kind of exhausted recognition. That's what she needed people to believe. He told me the real version. He and Colette had inherited a share of my grandfather's restaurant group together. When my grandfather died, Colette wanted to sell immediately. August wanted to hold and grow it. They disagreed, and Colette had found a way to make that disagreement look like theft. She'd had her name moved to the primary account, transferred the asset sale proceeds, and then told everyone in the family that August had drained it and run. He didn't fight it publicly, he said, because he had no money left to fight it with. By the time he rebuilt, years had passed, the family had calcified around Colette's version, and he decided the energy of fighting a story that everyone had already accepted wasn't worth it. But he had never stopped watching. I asked him why. Why watch from a distance for 30 years and do nothing? He leaned forward. Because I couldn't help someone who didn't know they needed help yet. He said it quietly. I watched you pay for her mistakes for years, Avery. Every time I thought about reaching out, I thought about what would happen. You would have defended her. You would have gone right back. I wanted to argue with that. I couldn't. He was right. He said the loan was the line I couldn't let pass. She used your name on a commercial instrument. That's federal territory. And there's something else. He paused. Then he said, when the restaurant group was sold, my grandfather had a provision written into the sale agreement, a legacy clause. It stated that a portion of the proceeds would be held in a designated account, accessible only upon the dissolution of the primary family business entity, which was Colette's catering operation, or upon documented evidence of fraud by the account holder against a family member. The account had been sitting there for almost 30 years. I stared at him. He said, your grandfather knew Colette. He knew what she was capable of. He built in a safeguard. I've been the trustee for that account since his death. The moment she used your forged signature on that loan, she triggered the clause herself. I thought about my grandfather, who I remembered only as a quiet man who kept hard candy in his front pocket and called me his little engineer because I used to stack his dominoes into structures. He had known. Somehow, decades before I was even old enough to understand what was happening to me, he had known. The next 3 days were silence from Colette's end. Philip had filed an emergency credit injunction and sent formal notice to Meridian Capital that the guarantor's signature was fraudulent and under investigation. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I went to work. I checked the structural load calculations on a pedestrian bridge project, and I answered my emails, and I acted like my world was not in the process of being completely dismantled and rebuilt at the same time. Then she showed up at my office, not my building, my actual office, on the 4th floor. She told the front desk she was my mother and that it was a family emergency. Someone had buzzed her up without checking with me first, which we had a very direct conversation about afterward. She came in while I was on a call. I held up one finger. She sat down across from my desk. She was wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, something new, stiff, like she'd bought it for a performance. Her face was a version of the face she always wore when she needed something from me. Soft eyes, a little tremble in the chin. I finished my call. I set down the phone. She said, "This has gone far enough, Avery. You are destroying this family over a misunderstanding." I said, "A misunderstanding." She said, "I needed the loan to expand. I was going to tell you. I just needed to move quickly, and I knew you'd say no if I asked, and I said, you thought you'd forge my signature instead." She flinched, but only for a second. Then the pivot. "You always make everything so difficult. I gave up everything for you kids. I built that business with my hands. And now you're dragging our name through a bank's legal department because you can't trust your own mother." I looked at her. I had looked at her 10,000 times across my entire life and seen 100 different versions of her. The mother who burned grilled cheese because she was crying over bills. The mother who threw a birthday party when I got into NC State. The mother who told me my condo was too expensive and that I was showing off. This time I looked at her and I saw something I had never let myself see before. I saw the pattern, the specific, deliberate pattern of a person who had spent decades learning exactly how to make me feel responsible for her choices. I said, "I know about the restaurant group." The soft eyes went flat. I said, "I know what you did to August. I know about the legacy clause. And I know that by forging my name on that loan, you triggered it yourself." She was very still. I said, "Philip has filed a fraud complaint with the North Carolina Attorney General's office. Meridian Capital has been notified that my signature was obtained without my knowledge or consent. And August's attorney is filing to activate the legacy clause, which means your catering business entity will be formally dissolved as a family business asset. Her mouth opened, closed. I said the Greensboro property, which you had mortgaged twice over, will be part of the asset review. She said, "You can't do this?" I said, "I already did." She said, "I am your mother." I said, "I know," and for a long time, I let that sentence mean that you could do whatever you wanted to me. I'm done letting it mean that. I stood up. I walked to my office door and opened it. I said, "I think you should go." She stood. She was shaking, not with grief, with the particular vibration of someone who has just lost their leverage and doesn't know yet what to do without it. She walked out without another word. I closed the door. I sat back down at my desk. My hands were completely steady. The formal proceedings took about 6 weeks. Philip handled most of it. The forensic handwriting analysis confirming the signature was forged came back quickly. Viridian Capital, facing a fraud complaint, moved fast to sever my name from the loan documentation. My credit report was corrected. My PE license was never formally at risk once the timeline of the fraud was established. My brother didn't call me during any of this. Not once. I'd half expected him to call on her behalf, the way he sometimes did, playing messenger between us when she wanted something but didn't want to ask directly. The silence told me everything I needed to know about where he stood. Colette hired a local attorney who made a brief attempt to argue that I had given implied consent by previously providing financial support to the family, which suggested a pattern of voluntary financial participation. Philip took exactly one sentence to dismantle that argument in the response filing. Implied consent is not a valid substitute for a notarized guarantor's signature on a commercial loan instrument. The judge agreed. The legacy clause was activated. Colette and Kin Enterprises, LLC, was dissolved as a recognized family business entity under the terms of my grandfather's agreement. The designated account, which had accumulated interest for nearly 3 decades, was transferred to August trusteeship for distribution according to my grandfather's original instructions. August called me the evening after the final order came through. He didn't say much. He just said, "It's done." I said, "I know." He said, "Your grandfather would have been proud of you." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said he set all this up because he knew she would eventually do something like this, didn't he? August said he knew her better than she ever knew herself. We talked for a while after that, not about the case, about my grandfather, about the restaurant he built from a single booth in a Greensboro diner, about the way he used to stack dominoes with me on the porch. August said he'd kept a photo of the two of us from when I was maybe 4 years old, sitting in the restaurant's back booth, and that he'd looked at it a lot over the years. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't find a way to reach you sooner." I told him not to be. I understood now what he'd meant about timing. I would not have been ready sooner. I would have defended her. I would have explained it away. I would have paid whatever new thing she invented as a reason to need me because it was easier than facing what was actually happening. It took a federal loan fraud notification to make me ready, and I think, if I'm being honest, I needed it to be that bad. I needed it to reach all the way to my professional license, to the one thing I had built for myself that no one had ever been able to claim as a resource, before I could finally stop protecting her from the consequences of who she was. I went home the night the case closed and I walked through my condo. I'd been in it for 3 years and I had always felt a low-grade anxiety in it, the specific anxiety of someone who knows they might be asked to give it up. The co-signed lease for my brother, the money wired for the van, the credit card charge for the so-called roof repair. Each one had been a small, quiet threat to this place. Each time I paid, I'd been buying temporary safety for something that was already mine. That night, for the first time, it just felt like home. I made tea. I sat by the window. I thought about my grandfather and his dominoes and the way he used to say, "Avery, a good structure holds because of what's underneath, not because of how it looks from the outside." He had been talking about buildings. I think he had also been talking about families. The one I had been born into was built on a foundation that had never been solid. It looked fine from the outside. Colette had made sure of that. But underneath was the rot of a story she'd needed to keep telling to keep everyone in their place. Me in the place of the one who pays. August in the place of the one who can't be trusted. My brother in the place of the one who never has to answer for anything. I had spent 31 years holding up a structure that was never designed to stand. I wasn't going to do it anymore. There's a difference I've learned between loving your family and being load-bearing for them. Load-bearing walls are necessary. Without them, a building collapses. But in a healthy structure, the load is shared. It's engineered to be distributed. No single wall is expected to hold everything on its own, indefinitely, without reinforcement, without rest. What I had been doing was not love. It was infrastructure that had been mislabeled. I took my phone. I opened my contacts. I found Colette's name. I didn't delete it, not exactly. I just removed her from the list of people I would answer at night. I removed her from the list of people I would wire money to. I removed her from the emergency contact field of every form that had ever listed her there. That last one was the one that made it real. I replaced it with August's number. I know that's not a resolution that works for everyone. I know that some people who hear stories like this want a dramatic finale, a scene in a courtroom, a last word, a closing door. I had some of those things. But the moment that actually ended it for me was a small one. A contact field. A name replaced by another name. An emergency contact who, it turned out, had been watching over me for 30 years from a distance, waiting for me to be ready to let him. Some structures look strong from the outside because they've been maintained with the labor of one person who was never meant to be carrying that much alone. When that person stops, the structure either finds new supports or it reveals what it always was. I stopped. And I found out what it always was. And for the first time in my adult life, what I'm building now is mine. Just mine. Engineered to last. If this story reached you somewhere real, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever been the load-bearing wall in a family that never asked if you were okay, tell me about it in the comments. I'd really like to know I'm not the only one. I've thought a lot about what my grandfather actually understood when he built that clause into the sale agreement. He wasn't a man who talked much about feelings. He stacked dominoes with me on his porch and told me that a good structure holds because of what's underneath. I thought he meant concrete and steel. He meant something else entirely. He had watched Colette his whole life. He knew the shape of what she was capable of. And instead of trying to change her, or warn people about her, or cut her off in some dramatic way, he just quietly built a consequence into the foundation. He didn't rage. He didn't punish. He just made sure that eventually the truth would have somewhere to land. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom. Not the moment I said no for the first time. Not even August calling me from Sarasota with 30 years of patience in his voice. What I keep coming back to is a man who understood that you cannot force people to be honest, but you can build a world where dishonesty eventually costs them exactly what they tried to protect. Colette spent decades protecting her version of the story, the martyr who rebuilt from nothing, the mother who sacrificed everything, the woman holding the family together while August, the villain, lurked somewhere off stage. She told that story so many times that it stopped being a lie and became, I think, something she actually believed. That's a particular kind of trap. When the fiction becomes the foundation, you stop being able to see the rot underneath it. I was part of that foundation. Every payment I made, every time I wired money or co-signed or charged something I couldn't really afford, I was reinforcing the story. I was making it possible for her to keep performing the version of herself that needed performing. My compliance wasn't kindness. It was, I understand now, a kind of damage. Not to her, to me. August couldn't pull me out of that. Nobody could. That's the hard part of the story that I don't think has an easy answer. There isn't a version where someone rescues you from a dynamic you haven't yet recognized as one. I had to see it myself. And I only saw it when it reached all the way to my professional license, the one thing I had built with my own hands and no one else's money. When it threatened that, I finally couldn't rationalize my way around it anymore. Intellect got me to Charlotte. It got me the PE license and the condo and the career, but intellect alone would have had me rationalizing Colette's behavior for another decade. What it took was something different, A willingness to let the story be what it actually was, not what I needed it to be to keep the peace. That's harder than any exam I ever sat for. It requires a kind of honesty about yourself that is genuinely uncomfortable because it means admitting that you chose repeatedly to look away. I'm not ashamed of that anymore. I was doing what made sense with what I knew. When I knew more, I did differently. That's all any of us can do. The consequences for Colette came not from anything I orchestrated in anger, but from choices she made freely over many years. The clause my grandfather built was waiting long before I was old enough to be hurt by her. She triggered it herself. That's not luck, and it's not fate. It's just the simple, patient reality that the things we do accumulate, they compound, and eventually they arrive at a reckoning that no amount of performance or manipulation can redirect. I've replaced her name in my emergency contact field with August's. It took about 4 seconds. It was the smallest and most significant thing I did in all of this. If you've ever been the load-bearing wall in a structure that was never designed to share the weight, I hope you hear this. Putting it down is not betrayal. It's the first honest thing you can do for yourself and, eventually, for everyone else.